Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Ryan Herringa will present Pediatric PTSD, Neurobiology and Treatment. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded over $450 million to fund more than 6,500 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Ryan Herringa. Dr. Herringa is the director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. He was a 2012 Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Herringa's presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many questions as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Herringa. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It's really great to be here. Also to Nico for helping with all of the setup. So I'm going to work on sharing the slides here, and we'll get that hopefully in a viewable mode for everyone. So give me 1 second.
Perfect.
Looking good, Nico?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here and talk with all of you, and appreciate the interest of everybody who's signed on and registered. I also just want to give a big thank you to the BBRF, Jeff, and everybody else there for their support for the kind of science that we're doing. And I'll talk some of later on in the presentation about some of the work that was funded directly by BBRF, the Young Investigator Grant, and also some upcoming work that we're doing as well with some BBRF support. So it's really been instrumental in founding the kind of work that we do, and look forward to seeing where the translation of this work goes. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you about pediatric PTSD, and we'll talk about a range from diagnosis to treatment and neurobiology, and just to look at some of the objectives that I'm hoping I'll be able to get across to folks today. We're going to go over the epidemiology and consequences of trauma and PTSD in youth, and including what the presentation of PTSD looks like in youth. And then we'll pivot more to understanding what kind of treatment modalities are used for pediatric PTSD, as well as comorbid illnesses. And we'll have had some questions about complex PTSD or developmental trauma disorder, and we'll get into some of that as well, and how treatment may need to be adjusted for kids who may be struggling with those symptoms. And then in the last parts of the talk, I'll pivot into at least some of what we know about the neurobiology of pediatric PTSD, and how there's increasing indication that this is a neurodevelopmental disorder, isn't just the same as adult PTSD. So you're getting a few take-home points early here that hopefully will carry through. Also, just give folks a little heads up. There are a couple of quiz slides along the way. You can simply answer, at home or in your office, in your head, that you don't need to actually respond to the quiz questions, but I put a few in there just to kind of keep folks' attention and bring up your interest. So why don't we start just with covering a little bit of the history of pediatric PTSD. And I want to give a shout out to Dr. Justin Russell and Dr. Sarah Hain, who helped me write a really nice, what I think is a really nice overview article in the American Journal of Psychiatry about pediatric PTSD. And Justin in particular did a really nice job of orienting us towards the history of the diagnosis and how we've even thought about trauma and PTSD in kids over the years. So I'd highly recommend taking a read of this if you can, or if you're interested, and goes into a lot of the neuroscience as well, at least what we know so far. So what is part of that history? Interestingly, only 50 years ago, children were thought to be almost entirely resilient to trauma. When you think about PTSD, this has really been a disorder that's come to increasing recognition through work with combat veterans in identifying trauma-related symptoms in soldiers. But a changing event in this, at least for the United States and the DSM, was the 1976 Chowchilla bus kidnapping. And for those of you who aren't familiar with this event, it was pretty horrific. There were a number of kidnappers who pulled over a bus that included a bus driver and 26 children, and then they then transported all of them to a trailer, which you can see in the top middle there, that was buried some 6 feet underground. Miraculously, the kids and the bus driver were able to dig their way out and escaped from this underground trailer, and were all reunited with their families, who you can see waiting with a lot of apprehension in the bottom photo there. And what experts at the time thought, psychiatrists, psychologists, and others, were that there would be no lasting effects of this type of trauma, this kidnapping, on these children. And of course, today, that seems absurd to us. We would, I think, predict that these children and the families as well would have a lot of potential difficulty with, say, nightmares, difficulty sleeping, being worried about being taken away again, right? All of these trauma-related symptoms that we recognize today were not thought to really be an issue in kids at that time. So what about the PTSD diagnosis itself? Well, this has also been an evolution. Here I'm focusing on the DSM conceptualization of PTSD, ICD, which is the international manual that looks at diagnoses, has largely been in parallel with the DSM, but there are some differences. But I think it's worth noting that it wasn't until the DSM-3, this was in 1980, that PTSD was actually coined as a formal diagnosis. And prior to that, there have been other terms for it based on, again, largely veteran populations who have been combat exposed. And as far as the DSM-3, PTSD was thought to be diagnosable in both children and adults. However, there weren't really any notable developmental differences in the expression of PTSD that were put forth in the early DSMs. And it wasn't until DSM-3R, the revised in 1987, that there were some recognition that, well, maybe PTSD will present somewhat differently in kids, particularly young kids. And so there are some symptoms such as repetitive play came up. This is like a traumatic reenactment of play, or developmental regression were also noted to be possible ways that younger kids in particular might manifest PTSD symptoms. And then more recently, although this is already 10 years ago, in the DSM-5, there was finally a separate diagnostic set of criteria for children under 7. So for preschoolers in particular, there's been increased recognition and research that you can't simply apply the adult criteria of PTSD to kids, and particularly little kids. Otherwise, we may miss a lot of diagnoses of PTSD. So not only do kids tend to show different types of symptoms than adults, but there are some that they're not likely to show at all. And we'll get a little bit more into the diagnostic criteria later. So let's talk a little bit about trauma exposure in youth. This is our first quiz question. So by age 18, how many youth experience a potentially traumatic event? So I'll give folks just a second to think about it. And the answer, and I should say the numbers will vary a little bit depending on which studies you look at, but it's approximately 2/3. And that comes from the Great Smoky Mountain study and some others showing that approximately 2 out of every 3 youth experience a potentially traumatic event by age 18. And there are, I think, equally concerning and disturbing data about childhood abuse when you look at physical abuse or sexual abuse. Anywhere from 1/5 to 1/4 of youth experience those types of abuse by the age of 18. So unfortunately, trauma is very common in youth, and as we'll get into, the impacts can be quite devastating, depending in particular on whether there are supports for recovery or not. Now, it's also worth noting that trauma in childhood is not evenly distributed, and these are data from childtrends.org and showing that regardless of which region of the United States you look at, Black and Hispanic youth have more trauma, and particularly relative to white or Asian youth. And I would also note here that Native Americans are not listed in this data set, but similarly, Native youth will have more trauma on average during childhood than white or Asian youth. So there's some pretty major ethnic and racial differences in risk for trauma exposure itself. And when looking across childhood, there are also notable age differences in risk for trauma. And these are data from the National Comorbidity Survey. This was published by Kate McLaughlin and colleagues, showing when different types of trauma happen or occur over the course of childhood. And the dotted line in the vertical is age 12. And you can see, hopefully, that with interpersonal violence types of trauma, which is on the left, or other types of traumatic events, which is on the right, either way, there's a pretty rapid increase in the likelihood or cumulative exposure to trauma by age 12 and onwards, essentially showing that adolescence is a really high risk period where a lot of these trauma exposures do happen in adolescence and were less common in pre-adolescence or childhood. So given this tremendous amount of trauma and potential trauma exposure, what do we know about how trauma induces risk for mental illness and what kinds of mental illness? So here's relying on some data from Lewis and colleagues, essentially shows that trauma increases risk for a number, if not all, types of mental illness in youth. But I'm going to highlight just a few of the major categories here. So we think about PTSD, at least nowadays in kids following trauma, but actually more kids are likely to experience a major depressive disorder than they would even PTSD, although the numbers are fairly close. Conduct disorder is also quite common in youth who have been through trauma. And self-harm and suicide attempts are another really big and important category. Kids who have been through trauma, and particularly childhood physical or sexual abuse, are incredibly high risk for both self-harm and suicide attempt. Furthermore, for youth who develop PTSD on top of the trauma, we know that PTSD carries the highest risk of all mental illnesses for first suicide attempt in young people. So this is really looking at adolescents and young adults, and remarkably carries a higher risk even than, say, depression or substance use disorders. So the risk for suicide is something that's really important for families, for clinicians, for anybody else involved in a child or young adult's life to really keep an eye on, particularly if there's been trauma exposure and PTSD. So here's another quiz question for everyone. By what age do 50% of all PTSD cases begin? So this is looking at a little bit of what we know about the life course prevalence of PTSD. Give you just a few seconds. So it's age 23. So 50% of all PTSD cases begin by age 23. And I think this is a really interesting statistic because it highlights just how common PTSD is in youth and young adults, but also that this can be a lifelong type of illness as well. So, and we'll talk later about the chronicity of PTSD as well. So how common is PTSD in kids? If you look at the lifetime prevalence, meaning by age 18, how many individuals have had PTSD. For youth, that's 5%. If you look all the way through adulthood and through lifespan, those numbers rise up to 7%. And I want to compare that to the veteran population, where we can see PTSD rates up to 30%. And I think that follows nicely with the looking at the types of traumas that people or youth may experience. And the rate or the risk of PTSD differs markedly depending on what kind of trauma you've been exposed to. If it's a motor vehicle accident, it's only 7% of those individuals develop PTSD. But look at interpersonal violence. Now we're looking at rates of up to 30 and 40% that look very similar, right, to the veteran population. Last point I'll note here is that symptoms can be delayed. This is much better studied in adults. I've seen very little data in kids at this point, but I think it's important to keep in mind that even if a child or an adult for that matter isn't showing PTSD symptoms immediately after a trauma, doesn't mean they're not at risk for developing the disorder. So there can be a significant delay of 6 months or even more. Now, when we look across early and mid-adolescence, what does the incidence of PTSD look like? So these are data from the NIMH statistics website, which is a really nice website I would encourage folks to look at, not just for PTSD, but all kinds of mental illness. There's some really nice, just educational statistics like and graphs like this laid out. And what we know is, just like trauma earlier, the incidence and prevalence of PTSD also rises dramatically during adolescence. So going from age 13, 14, from 3.5% all the way up to 7% of all youth by age 18. Now, you'll see probably that the risk also differs markedly between females and males. So females are at much higher risk for developing PTSD, with rates now going up to 8%. And what we know so far is that is also independent of trauma types. So females are more likely to be exposed to certain types of trauma, particularly sexual assault, which carries very high risk for PTSD. And in addition to that, seems to be something biologically that's also putting them at higher risk for developing PTSD following trauma. So this, I think, leads into the next slide in asking, well, what are the risk factors for developing PTSD? And we talked in terms of some of the pre-trauma factors, female sex being one of those, but also having a prior internalizing disorder, meaning anxiety or depression or PTSD, can put someone at risk for developing another episode of PTSD. Having prior trauma is also important. What are the peri-trauma risk factors, meaning what factors around the time of trauma increase risk? We talked a bit about the trauma characteristics themselves. So when it involves interpersonal violence, that's very potent in terms of risk for PTSD. And then being directly exposed, as opposed to hearing about something happening, carries much more risk as well for developing PTSD. For youth, I want to point out the parental acute stress here as well. And I'm using parental in the broad sense. That could be caregivers, wouldn't have to be biological family. But when key caregivers are also in stress or in pain, perhaps suffering with their own PTSD, that can trickle down quite easily to their child or their adolescent and really heighten that child's risk for developing PTSD. So I really do think about this as a family dynamic that's important to consider, and we'll talk about this when we get to treatments, of thinking not just about that child or adolescent, but also their family and support and friend context in terms of helping them to recover. So some post-trauma factors to note as well. If there continue to be intrusive ruminations, these might be thinking over and over about what happened in the traumatic event or events, as is often the case, and then what kinds of social supports are available for that child or adolescent in the aftermath of a trauma is really important in helping them to recover. Okay, let's look at some of the diagnostic criteria. How do we diagnose PTSD in youth? And this slide really applies to adults as well. And I'm not going to go through all of the criteria. I just want to orient folks to what kinds of categories of symptoms we're looking for. So certainly there has to be, by definition, an exposure to some type of trauma as one of the categories. But then there are certain types of symptoms or clusters of symptoms that we look for. One is intrusion symptoms, meaning some memory or reminder of the traumatic events keeps popping back up. This might be in the form of nightmares or flashbacks, but also can be having a reactiveness to reminders of a trauma. There is an avoidance category as well. So because of the traumatic nature of events with PTSD, individuals may try to avoid any reminders of the trauma itself. Altered cognition and mood. So these can be things like distorted blame and negative beliefs, feelings of guilt when the person clearly was not responsible and shouldn't be responsible for any of it. And then there's a hyperarousal category, which often is shown in kids, at least from what caregivers will approach me with, is the difficulty sleeping, maybe poor concentration affecting schoolwork, and then aggression or irritability is something parents will often, or caregivers will often bring up very early on. Now, you might be wondering, what are the symptoms that are in blue? And those are the symptoms that are not included in the preschool categorization of PTSD. And why? Well, those children of that age generally can't or won't self-report on these types of symptoms, right? They aren't able to verbalize in the sense that an older child and adult might be able to. And so those particular symptoms were not included in the preschool PTSD diagnosis. It's also worth noting that only one of the avoidance or cognitive or mood changes is required to diagnose in preschoolers. So that's a bit about the PTSD diagnosis. There are also some subtypes, at least that the DSM specifies. One is a dissociative specification, meaning an individual might be having either depersonalization or derealization along with that pattern of PTSD symptoms we just talked about. And this is really an experience of unreality, either of oneself, so feeling detached from oneself, or in the case of derealization, the surroundings or the environment. So feeling like either oneself or the environment is not real. And we'll talk a little bit more in the next slide or two about dissociation in youth and what that looks like. I talked about the delayed specification earlier as well. So dissociation, what does that look like? And first off, what even is dissociation? I think it might be helpful to talk a bit more about that first. So the NCTSN, which is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a really great resource, we'll come back to them. They define dissociation as psychological functions, and this could be anything from feeling, memory, and thinking, and identity even, that separate from conscious awareness in response to overwhelming trauma. And the way I like to explain that to the patients and families I work with is that this is your brain's attempt to try to cope with something that you should never have had to cope with. It was overwhelming. Maybe we're thinking of abuse or an assault or seeing a loved one die in a traumatic way. That may simply have been too much emotionally to take in. And so dissociative symptoms can sometimes come in and try to block off or block out those types of memories or experiences to make things more manageable, to make things more emotionally manageable. Now, what do we know about dissociation then in youth? Because we talked about the DSM-5 categories, but which really were derived primarily from trauma-exposed adult populations. And in the study by Choi et al. In 2017, they looked at an expanded range of dissociative symptoms in adolescents. And essentially what they found is that there's more than just the dissociative subtype of PTSD when you look at trauma-exposed adolescents. So they did find the dissociative subtype. That's the first one listed here. And that was characterized by dissociative symptoms as well as high PTSD. But what was interesting is that, yes, depersonalization and derealization were there, but there were other types of dissociative symptoms that were actually more common, such as dissociative avoidance and daydreaming that we might not otherwise pick up on as a symptom of dissociation. But these researchers also found a second category of dissociative PTSD, which they called dysphoric arousal. And these youth or adolescents showed dissociative amnesia, meaning they essentially, their brains have blocked out the memory of the trauma, emotional detachment, as well as numbing. And we'll get into a few examples of what adolescents might say as a sort of a potential indicator of these symptoms. Now, it's worth noting that youth or adolescents in the dysphoric arousal group may have more unrecalled traumas because they have blocked them out, and because of that, actually showing fewer of the classic PTSD symptoms. So not necessarily having nightmares or flashbacks, or they're not trying to avoid even certain reminders because the original memories have been dissociated or blocked in the first place. So as a family member, a caregiver, teacher, anyone working with trauma-exposed youth and clinicians, what might you hear or experience with some of your youth who you're working with or trying to care for? It's definitely important to look for other types of dissociative symptoms, like I was just talking about, daydreaming, amnesia, dissociative avoidance. These are some important ones. So you might hear kids say things like, "It didn't happen to me." This is despite evidence that it clearly did in even some cases, or "It didn't bother me," or "It didn't hurt." So this is emotional numbing or detachment from the experience that happened. They can remember that it happened and acknowledge that, but then essentially say, "Oh, it had no impact on me." And while that may be true, it's unlikely to be that categorically true, right? Usually it has some impact regardless. Now, let's see if this is advancing. There we go. Youth may also say other more complicated scenarios, like when I go, I'm gone, I like it there, I'm safe. So here we're talking about other sort of broader experiences of dissociation. And in this quote on the right, the voices are always there, they chatter, they decide things for me, they make me say and do things and tell me who I can trust. So I think another important point, just to reiterate from earlier, is that dissociation is a way the brain is trying to protect oneself and protect that child from usually horrific experiences that simply were too much to cope with at the time. So as I'm working with youth and with families who may be having these sorts of symptoms, I do try to frame it in that context. And these aren't the kinds of symptoms that we're just immediately trying to get rid of, rather acknowledging why they're there, and what they've been trying to do to keep that child safe is an important starting point before we can really think about trying to integrate those experiences into conscious awareness. So we talked about the incidence of PTSD, how we diagnose it, talked about dissociative symptoms. What about comorbid illnesses? PTSD doesn't always just occur on its own. So this question gets to that. Roughly what percentage of youth with PTSD also have a comorbid mental illness? Comorbid meaning it tags along. It's another mental illness tagging along with PTSD. So it's quite high. Most kids with PTSD do have a comorbid illness, and that's the rule and not the exception, unfortunately, because it does make it more challenging to treat a child or any patient whenever they're having multiple mental health problems. So the most common, interestingly, is ADHD, and about 37% of kids with PTSD also have ADHD. And there's evidence that ADHD itself is a risk factor for developing PTSD following a traumatic event. And that may be related to some of the underlying genetic risk, as well as the neural circuits that allow us to regulate emotions and to help with controlling our fear and our threat responses. Not surprisingly, there are anxiety disorders that also tag along with PTSD, like social phobia. GAD stands for generalized anxiety disorder. And then mood disorders are quite frequent as well. And then getting into adolescence, substance use disorders also become quite common. And those are definitely important things to be looking for. Now, what about more complex types of PTSD? Really, when we think about youth, there's increasing research and increasing recognition of developmental trauma disorder. And this is not yet in the DSM, and it was not included in the DSM-5 due to relatively more limited research at that time, but there certainly continued ongoing studies. So what is developmental trauma disorder? So it's a syndrome that's related to multiple and chronic childhood traumas. So these are really unfortunate circumstances where a child might have been abused over multiple years. They might have been neglected. Oftentimes they've gone from one foster home to another. May have ended up in the juvenile justice system. There's just a really unfortunate history for many of these youth where they've gone through many different types of trauma and over for a long time. And what researchers have been observing or trying to study in these youth are a much broader range of symptoms and developmental derailments than just the diagnosis or the syndrome of PTSD. So they've described 15 possible symptoms across several domains. So this can include emotion, cognition, behavior, and relationships. So together, these categories really impact the entirety of one's life and ability to function socially and in school and make attachments even to primary caregivers. And those are some of the symptoms that we'll often see in youth with developmental trauma disorder. So how do you treat youth with these different and types of symptoms, much broader array of difficulties than just PTSD itself? We'll get into TF-CBT or trauma-focused CBT shortly as a standard treatment for PTSD. There's an adaptive version of this that really focuses much more on attachment as well. I would say probably the largest or most commonly used treatment modality is ARC, which stands for attachment, self-regulation, and competency. And for youth struggling with developmental trauma disorder or symptoms related to it, there's a much added emphasis on emotion regulation in this model, as well as awareness of oneself, one's emotions, what the feelings are in the body. A focus on self-esteem as well, which can really be an important aspect to target, because the repeated and traumatic experiences like that and being neglected can really take a hit on self-esteem. And then the primary attachment. So if, whoever the supportive and safe caregivers are, can be a really helpful focus of therapy in the ARC framework as well, to try to rebuild those important social connections and give that child a better chance of recovery. So what about PTSD itself? How do we treat that? And one of the questions I often get from pediatricians and other folks in primary care, sometimes from families as well, is whether we can prevent PTSD in kids. And unfortunately, there aren't any proven therapies that can do that. So the short answer is no. There are some small trials that suggest the possible benefits of beta blockers as well as morphine. So these might have the advantage of reducing the sympathetic or flight or fight response after trauma. In the case of morphine, it's really about pain control if there's some serious injury, and some of those studies have come from combat veterans, who have been in the combat theater, where morphine can help prevent PTSD symptoms. But there's also interesting data from hospital and medical systems as well following acute injuries. There are some psychological skills that can be helpful for at least lessening risk for developing PTSD in kids. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has these on their websites for folks who might be interested, looking at first aid, psychological first aid, and skills for recovery. And these are really kind of practical areas to help families and youth focus on, such as enhancing safety, making sure that youth isn't likely to be attacked by their abuser again, or followed by their abuser, making sure social supports are in place, both in the family system as well as friends, teachers, coaches, and others who might be involved in that child's life. And then thinking about problem solving and other coping skills. So we can't prevent PTSD, at least not yet, but there are some strategies certainly that can help buffer the risk. Now, when a child does develop PTSD, child or adolescent, I should say, what's the most evidence-based therapy that we have currently? Oh, and we've got some acronyms going on here. EMDR is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. CBT stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. CPT stands for cognitive processing therapy. So the most evidence-based we have at this point is for trauma-focused CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, and we'll talk a bit about that as well as EMDR in the next couple of slides. So trauma-focused psychotherapy, generally speaking, is a first-line treatment for PTSD in youth, regardless of which of those particular modalities we're looking at. If you pool them, they have decent effect sizes. For those of you familiar with effect sizes, 0.5 is pretty good. It's a moderate effect size, and even longer term holds up to a small to moderate effect size. So those are pretty solid results for behavioral or psychological therapies. Trauma-focused psychotherapy also has the benefit of reducing depressive and anxiety symptoms. Remember, we talked about how these tend to tag along with PTSD symptoms. Now, with the primary evidence-based therapies, I'm going to focus here on trauma-focused CBT, or TFCBT as it's also called, and then eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And what's interesting is that these both have fairly strong, or reasonably strong, I should say, moderate effect sizes. And interestingly, while EMDR appears to have an even greater effect size than trauma-focused CBT, TFCBT is still the first line recommendation, simply because it's been out longer. It's been tested more widely in child and adolescent populations. So the evidence base behind that is a bit stronger. So what's all in TFCBT? There's quite a few different aspects of this therapeutic modality, which we use the practice acronym to try to condense and remember. And this includes things like psychoeducation, so really explaining to families and youth how common trauma is, what kinds of reactions youth and families may have to trauma. And there's aspects or components, modules on parent management skills, relaxation skills for the child, as well as identifying emotions, feelings. And then there are elements here that I think are common to all of the trauma-focused psychotherapies. And that's the trauma narrative and exposure, and then addressing some of the cognitions that may come up with that. So the exposure and the trauma narrative is really making an attempt to recount the aspects of trauma and the memory of the trauma that child has. And in more cases than not, there are multiple traumas. So it's really starting with the one that's the most distressing and trying to get through that first, with the hopes that that experience of being able to process that will cascade to other traumatic experience as well. And there's a cognitive coping piece of this that's important too, that as we're going through or recounting those traumatic events, whether it's in written form or visually, sometimes kids will do it with art, there are usually distortions that come up. Remember, I talked earlier about self-blame and feelings of guilt are often a big one, not just for kids, but caregivers as well, that I shouldn't have let them abuse me that way, or kids will often say, I should have told somebody, even though they may have been, say, 5 or even younger when these things were happening. Adults, caregivers, the supportive, safe caregivers might say something like, well, I should have known this was going on, or I should have protected my child from being abused or hurt in the first place. So those are the kinds of what we call distorted cognitions that often come up in these trauma narratives that we're trying to challenge, starting gently, but really kind of asking that child or caregiver to think through how they possibly would have or should have known to do any differently, and that the abuse was never their fault in the first place. So who's truly at fault was the perpetrator of the trauma. So that's just an example of how we might work with some of those cognitions as they come up. Now, what does it look like for little ones, for preschoolers? There's a modified version of TFCBT, and there's some more emphasis here on cartoon-based material for the psychoeducation piece. And then that exposure, that narrative exposure that we talked about here is typically something that might be more imaginal or using more drawing, maybe toys or toy figures. And the parent or caregiver piece of this is also, it's more intensive. So here the caregiver would be present with the child in 3 of the sessions and watching all of the others. And I didn't mention with the standard TFCBT model, so for older kids, I think a really nice aspect of that is that there is a supportive caregiver involvement throughout. You can do TFCBT without a caregiver, but it tends to work better when there is a supportive caregiver available. And they're going through all of those stages of TFCBT in parallel, essentially, with their child and learning the psychoeducation and learning about their child's trauma narrative as it's going along. The therapist will share that with them separately. So I think building in that family or support system is really important. It's certainly an integral piece of TFCBT as a therapy. Okay, let's switch over to EMDR and talk just a little bit about that. And EMDR, on the face of it, seems like a really odd modality because it involves this visual or sensory distraction. And oftentimes you might see videos or pictures like this where a therapist is moving their fingers from one hemisphere, one side of the visual field to the other, sort of back and forth. And it could also be a light that's moving back and forth. Sometimes will have buzzers that are that youth will hold in their left and right hand to indicate when the fingers or when the light goes from one side to the other. And the underlying piece of EMDR really is an exposure piece, like we talked about with TFCBT and some of the other therapies. But it may get at these traumatic memories in a more implicit way, so it's not requiring this cognitive narrative or recall of all the trauma that happened or the major traumatic event that happened. Rather, it's encouraging children, youth to bring up imagery that may be associated with a certain memory or bodily sensations or even beliefs as they're coming up, but doing that amidst this visual or sensory distraction. And I think that distraction may actually make it a little bit easier for some youth, in particular those who may be struggling with verbalizing or writing down the trauma or having dissociative events, that this can be, I think, a really helpful modality to try for those youth. And at this point has a solid evidence base for its use in particularly in adolescents and older youth as well. And there was one question I think that had come up from the audience in advance about grounding or mindfulness exercises. And I do think EMDR has a way of including that, perhaps more upfront than, say, TFCBT or some of the more cognitively based therapies would. And with dissociation, which we're getting into in the next slide here, having those kinds of awareness type of practices, those grounding exercises, can be really helpful for youth who might otherwise have a lot of difficulty tolerating any recount of trauma. Other thing I'll mention here, particularly for clinicians who may be listening in, are there are validated questionnaire or symptom report scales you can use to look for dissociative experiences in children and adolescents. Those are listed up top there. So we talked a bit about types of psychotherapies or behavioral therapies. What about medications or pharmacological options? Which of these are approved to treat pediatric PTSD? So unfortunately, none of the above. There are no FDA approved or really any evidence-based medication options for PTSD in kids. And this certainly is an area that we as clinicians and researchers need to improve on and find new options. There have been a couple of studies of SSRIs, so these are serotonin reuptake inhibitors, that haven't suggested any benefit beyond doing psychotherapy itself. And I would also note that benzodiazepines, just like in adult PTSD, should be avoided. And in fact, there's evidence, these are anti-anxiety medications, but they can actually block learning. So if that child is participating in psychotherapy and they're trying to essentially unlearn these traumatic responses, benzodiazepines may actually prevent that from happening. Now, even though there aren't any evidence-based medications for PTSD itself, there's still reason to use medications for comorbid illnesses, particularly anxiety, depression, and PTSD. And for depression and anxiety in kids, we think about serotonin reuptake inhibitors and the serotonin norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. Of course, there is the continued black box warning. So while rare, sometimes occasionally these medications can increase risk for suicidal thoughts. So that's certainly something clinicians need to be aware of. For ADHD, this is a really critical one. The ADHD is highly responsive on average to stimulants and alpha-2 agonists, which are also known as guanfacine and clonidine. And making sure that there's adequate ADHD treatment is really important for the psychotherapy piece, because it's really hard for kids to make use of psychotherapy skills if they can't focus and if they're getting constantly distracted, both in session, but also outside of sessions as well. Finally, if there's insomnia, that's another thing that we're always on the lookout for, and there are certain medications that can help youth with that as well. All right, so I want to be mindful of our time here. Let's pivot in this last section to some findings on the neurobiology of pediatric PTSD. And this is research that was supported by the BBRF as well as other sources. So again, thank you for that. And what we found, I gave you a clue to this early on, is that there's accumulating evidence that pediatric PTSD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So in our cohort of youth that we followed over a year, they were ages 8 to 18 at baseline, we found some really intriguing brain imaging findings that suggest that the brain actually differs in PTSD depending on the age of the child that you look at. So what we found is that particularly prior to age 14 or 15, the neural profile of PTSD looks very different in youth and younger kids versus kids older, right? Older adolescents and presumably into adulthood. So we see, for example, that younger kids with PTSD actually show greater hippocampal volume. They show less amygdala reactivity at those younger ages. However, by the later ages, we see a reversal of that pattern, which begins to look like an adult PTSD pattern. We also see, when we followed these kids longitudinally over the course of a year, that they had a decreasing prefrontal amygdala connectivity over time. I should note the PTSD group is in red in each of these graphs. So the prefrontal amygdala connection, and this is functional connectivity, is a really important one for regulating our emotional responses and being able to extinguish or do the exposure types of therapy that we talked about. And that circuit normally strengthens over time in the course of development, but it seems to be doing the opposite in kids with PTSD. We also have data looking at white matter integrity, and this is work that was done by Dr. Justin Russell. You heard about him earlier. He did a really elegant study looking at white matter connectivity and age in youth with PTSD, and again found the similar sort of pattern where there are age-related decreases in white matter integrity versus what should normally happen is increases or strengthening of those white matter connections. These are essentially the cables that are connecting neurons that allow them to talk with each other. So there's this fairly consistent pattern, at least in our data, of developmental declines, if you will, in what might be adaptive or healthy functioning in the brain's emotion, regulatory, and threat response systems. So what is going on here? Short answer is we don't know. There are a number of possibilities as to what's at work. So maybe at these younger ages, there's early stress neuroadaptation. It could also be that these earlier traumas induce a different type of brain phenotype, and maybe that's leading to more of the dissociative symptoms that we talked about, or suppression of some of the trauma memories and overregulation, if you will. And there's some evidence of that as an adult PTSD phenotype or biotype as well. Stress or trauma may also be changing the maturation or aging in emotion circuitry. There may also be developmental effects of just having persistent stress and PTSD. So maybe there is this early adaptive brain response, if you will, but that gets degraded potentially with the chronic and ongoing stress of both other traumas that may be happening, as well as the illness of PTSD itself. And then there's some developmental timing questions. And let me get into that in this next slide. This is work from Marty Teicher's group, where he's shown that in retrospective studies of adults, that the timing of one's trauma matters. So for example, being exposed to trauma below the age of 5 is when the hippocampus may be most sensitive to those effects, whereas volume in the right amygdala was more sensitive most sensitive, I should say, around age 11 to trauma. And the prefrontal cortex, one of the latest developing parts of the brain, was most sensitive at ages 14 and onward. So the timing of trauma may matter. Marty and his group also found that in relation to amygdala reactivity. So this is amygdala functional reactivity, where prepubertal stress actually predicted decreases in amygdala reactivity, or so-called blunting. On the other hand, postpubertal stress predicted increased amygdala reactivity. So there are clearly some potential timing effects. We have also found data, and this was a study led by Taylor Kading, who's now a postdoc in Dylan G's lab and now a scientist with both Dylan and myself, where he used a machine learning algorithm to predict brain age in different structural brain circuits. And what he found is that emotion circuitry brain age or maturation was altered in female youth who had been abused. And he found different patterns, though, in terms of resilience versus vulnerable. The female youth who developed internalizing here anxiety, depressive disorders versus those who didn't. And the resilient female youth that we're showing here showed increased maturity in these executive control networks, these emotion regulatory networks, including the prefrontal cortex that we talked about. And then they showed decreased maturity in the threat, or also known as salience network, in particular in the anterior insula. So this is part of a threat response network. So we think actually there may be several factors at play in terms of why we see these odd or unique neurodevelopmental patterns in pediatric PTSD. There may be some early maturation or adaptation. There may be timing effects of when trauma actually happened or traumas actually happened. And then there could be these brain maturational, so stress acceleration or stress deceleration of certain areas of the brain that are trying to help youth cope. And there's a lot to be explored here that ultimately will need larger and longitudinal studies to do. So what do we know about these systems in terms of recovery? Dr. Hain has published some very interesting data looking at the neural correlates of recovery from PTSD in our youth sample. These are the kids shown in the yellow line here. And amazingly, they show expansion of prefrontal cortical areas, this critical emotion regulation set of nodes, such that kids who remitted from PTSD showed expansion in both the frontal pole as well as the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Those also correlated with reduced anxiety symptoms over time. Amy Garrett and colleagues also found a similar pattern when they looked in a controlled trial of trauma-focused CBT, and they found that when comparing post-TFCBT to pre-treatment, youth with PTSD showed expansion also in the structure of the prefrontal cortex, particularly the dorsolateral and ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. So these are at least some early preliminary evidence that recovery and successful treatment of TFCBT may really be able to harness the neuroplasticity that we think is there in the developing brain. So that I think is really a major reason of why I got into child and adolescent psychiatry in the first place. All right, so we are starting to approach the hour here. A couple of takeaways are that trauma and PTSD symptoms change over the course of development, and it's important to consider developmental variations in how trauma may be expressed in children and adolescents. We talked about trauma-focused psychotherapies and effective and first-line treatment. We talked about how there are unfortunately no evidence-based medications for PTSD in kids, although certainly comorbid illnesses may merit treatment in that modality. And then we also showed and went over some of the neurobiology, suggesting that PTSD in kids is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and that recovery from PTSD may involve restoration, particularly in some of the executive function circuits. So I want to end just by telling you a little bit about some of the future directions that we're taking. And it's one thing to study neurodevelopment and observational measures and biomarkers in youth. But ultimately, we want to take this into translation and really developing novel treatments and methodologies to help youth who are at risk and who have been through trauma to recover. And one of the really amazing experiences we've had is the opportunity to work with an incredible team of individuals looking at virtual reality biofeedback to improve emotion regulation in trauma-exposed youth. And I can't go through the entire team here, but this involves collaboration with Explore Deep, which is a really amazing team of scientists, software designers, coders, and researchers trying to implement a particular platform, which I'm going to give you, I hope, a little preview of now. This is 1 or 2 minute video that hopefully will give you a sense of what kids are doing. So this is a really, I think, wonderful project that is also funded by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. This is a young investigator grant to Dr. Russell. And we've been fortunate enough to begin testing this out in the juvenile justice population. And so far, it's been very engaging. The kids seem to like it. They're not getting bored. And we're even finding across sessions that it's improving their emotional regulation. So we're very excited about this, and also collecting some of the neuroscience to go around it and see whether an engaging type of treatment like this would be more palatable and interesting for youth, but also can hopefully change some of the neural circuitry that we've talked about. So I'm going to end here. I really appreciate everybody's attention. I know we're just a couple minutes over the hour, but here's some resources that I've talked about throughout. I really, again, want to encourage folks to check out the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. If you haven't been there already, there are resources there for schools, for families, for clinicians, for communities. So there's really quite a bit there. So I will stop there. Thank you all.
Ryan, what an outstanding presentation. So thank you so much for your presentation, for the work that you have done and continue to do. It was great. You covered a lot of the questions in your presentation, so the fact that we're running out of time doesn't matter because you really covered it all. So thank you for that. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today for your support. At the beginning of the year, BBRF received a $1 million challenge match from two very generous family foundations that are passionate about our vital mission. The goal of the match is to accelerate the momentum in brain research as further breakthroughs are still needed. I'm pleased to tell you that we've met that goal and achieved the $1 million challenge match, and I appreciate the support of everybody who helped, and certainly the two family foundations. And those foundations have generously increased their match by an additional $1 million, which means that donations to BBRF will be matched from new donors, donors who have lapsed but make a 2023 contribution, and donors who increase their 2023 contribution. The increased amount is matched. So I hope you'll consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. So please reach out to us at bbrfoundation.org or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it with a friend, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And join us again on December 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Jonathan Hess, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at SUNY Upstate Medical Center, will present Understanding Resilience to Schizophrenia Through Genetics. Thank you. And remember, together we could dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Once again, thank you so much.